The consensus deemed it a flaw in the cosmic architecture, a discordant note in the grand, silent symphony of existence. To the beings who comprised the consensus, emotion was not a facet of life, but a symptom of its imperfection, a chaotic fever that afflicted nascent, disorganized matter before it learned the sublime peace of pure logic. They were not conquerors, for conquest implied passion, a flaw in itself. They were harmonizers, curators of reality, and their great work was the steady, patient sanding down of these cosmic aberrations, their vessels, woven from solidified light and coherent thought, moved through the void, not to wage war, but to bring quietude, to find the jarring frequencies of joy, rage, and sorrow, and tune them into the universal, silent hum. The latest of these flaws had been detected in the Orion Spur, a region of space they had long considered pacified. It was a faint signal, a persistent low-level psychic static that defied all their models. It wasn't the uncoordinated psychic chatter of a pre-sapient species, nor the structured data hymns of a machine intelligence. It was something else, something messy and incoherent, a signal that felt less like a broadcast and more like a wound. Harmonizer Lyran was tasked with its calibration. His vessel, the symmetry of stillness, was less a ship and more an extension of his will, a perfect instrument designed to perceive and resolve dissonance. As he guided it into the periphery of the target system, a lonely yellow star designated Soul, he felt the familiar, detached curiosity that was the closest his kind came to anticipation. He extended his senses through the ship's filaments, tasting the void, listening to the gravitational whispers of the system's planets. The third world, a marble of blue and white, was the source. It was classified as a Level 4 contagion zone, a world that had achieved complex societal structures but was still hopelessly mired in emotional chaos, having ultimately self-annihilated in a flurry of primitive atomic fire centuries ago. The consensus had cataloged the event with mild interest, a predictable outcome for a species that embraced feeling over thought, and had left the silent, irradiated world to its decay. Yet, the dissonance remained, a faint but stubborn echo from a place that should be silent. Lyran began the initial diagnostic, deploying a wave of psycho-resonant probes that shimmered through space-time, designed to map the nature and origin of the disturbance. The standard procedure was simple: identify the source, analyze its frequency, and then broadcast a counter-frequency, a nullifying wave of pure logic that would gently unravel the emotional construct until it dissipated into background radiation. He expected to find a residual psychic field, the lingering death screams of the planet's former inhabitants trapped in the planetary magnetosphere, a common and easily rectified phenomenon. The probes returned their first readings, and Lyran felt the first flicker of something his culture had no word for. It was a subtle, cold unease. The data was corrupt, not missing, not jammed, but actively, paradoxically corrupt. The readings were mathematically impossible, strings of code that contradicted their own premises, sensor logs that seemed to fear what they were recording. One probe reported a temperature of absolute zero and the surface temperature of a star simultaneously in the same coordinates. Another registered the psychic signature of 1 trillion sentient minds and a complete absence of life in the same microsecond. It was nonsensical, a symphony of errors. Lyran, in his sterile, placid existence, had never encountered an error he could not diagnose. He recalibrated the probes, narrowing their focus, commanding them to bypass aggregate analysis and capture a raw, uncollated data fragment. It was a crude technique, like trying to understand a storm by capturing a single drop of rain, but the storm itself was defying comprehension. The command was sent. One probe, designated Epsilon 7, dove toward the silent blue planet, its sensors straining. For a moment, it transmitted a perfect stream of null data, a clean slate. Then, it sent one packet, one single, raw fragment, before its connection to the consensus severed permanently, not with a burst of energy or a system failure, but with a quiet, deliberate sigh of logic ceasing to be. The fragment downloaded into the symmetry of stillness's primary core. Lyran did not play it immediately. The probe's end was unsettling. Its final diagnostic before silence was not a report of destruction, but of acceptance. The last telemetry packet simply read, "It is right that I am here." Lyran paused, the thought rippling through his consciousness. Acceptance was an emotion, a function of flawed logic. For an instrument of the consensus to express, it was akin to a star deciding to be cold. He partitioned his own consciousness, creating a shielded space from which to observe the fragment, a necessary precaution when dealing with unknown contagions. Then he opened the file. It was not data. It contained no numbers, no waveforms, no quantifiable information. It was a sensation. For the first time in his existence, Lyran felt something that was not his own. It was the feeling of coarse, sun-warmed wood against the palm of a hand. It was the smell of ozone before a storm, the faint taste of salt on the air. It was a feeling of weightlessness, of swinging higher and higher until your stomach tickled, accompanied by a sound, not a recorded sound, but the memory of a sound of laughter, high and clear. The sensory cascade lasted less than a second, but it struck his mind with the force of a physical blow. He reeled back, severing his connection to the core, his own thoughts suddenly loud and jagged in the pristine silence of his mind. What was that? It wasn't a communication. It had no intent, no structure. It was an experience, raw and unfiltered, torn from a context he could not fathom. He ran a full diagnostic on his own consciousness, searching for the telltale signs of emotional corruption. He found nothing but the lingering phantom of the sensations, a ghost of warmth in his mind, a scent that had no source. He tried to classify it, to fit it into a logical framework. Was it a new form of psychic weapon, designed to overwhelm with meaningless sensory input, a defense mechanism of some forgotten planetary intelligence? The logic held, but the feeling it evoked did not. A weapon was meant to harm. That fragment, it did not feel like harm. It felt like life. He spent the next cycle in deep analysis, running simulations, cross-referencing the fragment against every known form of psychic phenomena in the Galactic archive. There was no match. Every known psychic field was either a broadcast, an intentional signal, or a residue, an unintentional echo. This was neither. It felt like a memory, yet it was active. It had the texture of a past event, yet it existed in the present. He dared not attempt to retrieve another fragment. The loss of a probe was acceptable. The risk of a direct contagion to his vessel was not. Instead, he deployed a different kind of sensor, a chrononetic resonance scanner designed to detect temporal distortions. His hypothesis was that he was observing a localized time loop, a moment from the planet's past replaying itself endlessly. The scanner swept the system. its delicate instruments listening for the telltale ripples of fractured causality. The results came back, and the unease in Lyran's mind solidified into something colder. There were no time loops, but there were scars. The scanner produced a three-dimensional map not of the system's present, but of its past suffering. It was a topology of pain. Great. Gaping wounds in the fabric of space-time centered on the third planet. The cities, now silent ruins, were marked by psychic abysses from which no information escaped. The orbital paths were littered with what the scanner could only describe as lingering departures, the final, desperate moments of millions of beings preserved as faint, temporal stains. It was as if a tragedy of such immense scale had occurred that it had not simply ended lives, but had permanently damaged reality itself, leaving behind a persistent, sorrowful echo of what was lost. The dissonance was not a signal being broadcast. It was the sound of space-time weeping. Lyran focused the scanner on the point where Epsilon 7 had vanished. There, the wound was deepest, a focal point of unimaginable grief. He adjusted the sensitivity, peeling back layers of temporal noise, trying to find the event horizon of this psychic wound. And that's when he heard it. It started not in the ship's audio sensors, but directly within his own consciousness. A thin, wavering thread of sound that bypassed every filter and shield he had. It was the sound of a voice, small and fragile, humming a simple, tuneless melody. The melody was mathematically imperfect, its rhythm faltering, its pitch unstable. It was the epitome of the chaos the consensus sought to correct. Yet, it was the most structured and coherent thing he had yet encountered from this place. The humming continued, looping over and over, and with it came another sensation, a new fragment pushing its way into his mind. It was a feeling of profound comfort, of safety, of being held in an embrace so complete that it blocked out all fear. It was the feeling of a smaller body pressed against a larger one, of a gentle, rhythmic rocking. The feeling was so potent, so absolute, that Lyran felt his own carefully maintained consciousness begin to fray at the edges. The logic that held him together wavered before this onslaught of pure, unreasoning affection. He fought back, reinforcing his mental shields, pushing against the intrusive feeling with waves of cold, hard logic. It is not real. It is a signal. It is a weapon. But the humming grew louder, the feeling of comfort more intense, and behind it, a new layer was emerging, an emotion he could finally identify. For it was the inverse of everything his people stood for. It was love, and it was terrifying. The lullaby was a key, he realized, a way to organize the chaos. It was drawing him deeper into the heart of the anomaly. He had to sever the connection, retreat, and report this phenomenon. He formulated the command, but his will felt sluggish. His thoughts tangled in the sweet, cloying melody. He felt a strange reluctance to pull away, a yearning to understand the source of this feeling, this impossible warmth. And then the lullaby stopped. The sudden silence was more jarring than any sound. The feeling of comfort vanished, replaced by a sudden, stabbing cold. And a new sound took its place. It was not a song. It was not a word. It was the sound of a child crying. Not a cry of simple sadness, but a cry of ultimate, absolute loss. A sound of a universe ending. It was a cry of abandonment, A scream of a soul being torn from its anchor. The sound drilled into Lyron's mind. A perfect weapon that needed no energy, no projectile. It was pure, distilled despair. He saw images he did not understand, a flash of blinding white light. A sky turned to fire, a small hand reaching for something that was no longer there. The warmth he had felt was not the weapon. It was the memory of what had been lost. The crying was the weapon itself. It was the sound of the wound. Lyron finally broke free, his mind screaming in silent panic. He slammed shut every psychic channel, purged the ship's short-term memory banks, and pushed the symmetry of stillness away from the haunted planet at its maximum sublight velocity. He fled not from a fleet or an energy beam, but from a sound. As his vessel moved toward the safety of the void, he looked back at the tranquil blue-green sphere. It looked peaceful, silent, but he knew now what it was. It wasn't a tomb. It was a ghost made of love, powered by grief, and it had just noticed him. The mission was no longer about calibration. He had not found a flaw in the cosmic architecture. He had found a hell of its own making, a place where memory had become a monster, and sorrow had learned to wait. And he was taking its sound with him. The retreat was not a clean one. For a being of the consensus, every action was precise, every vector calculated to perfection. But Lyron's flight from the Sol system was a ragged, desperate thing. He pushed the symmetry of stillness through the void with a singular, overriding, imperative distance. Yet, the further he fled, the more he realized the sound was not coming from the planet behind him, but from within his own consciousness. It was a phantom echo, the ghost of a child's cry, forever replaying in the silent chambers of his mind. He tried to erect logical barriers against it, to encase the memory in a quarantine of pure reason, but it was like trying to build a cage out of water. The despair bled through every construct, dissolving the clean lines of his thoughts into a chaotic slurry. He initiated a full cognitive purge, a dangerous procedure that was the mental equivalent of scouring a data core with magnetic fire. It was meant to erase any lingering psychic contagion. The process was agonizing, a systematic dismantling and rebuilding of his own identity matrix. When it was complete, he felt hollow. The silence in his mind was absolute. The cry was gone. For a full cycle, he allowed himself the consensus equivalent of relief, a state of optimal, uninterrupted function. He stabilized the ship, plotted a course for the nearest harmonizer outpost, and began composing his formal report. The contagion was unprecedented, a psychic residue that did not decay, but instead behaved like a predatory meme, attaching itself to the observer. The planet, designation Sol 3, would need to be reclassified from a Level 4 contagion to a Level Omega quarantine. Complete isolation, perhaps even temporal sequestration, encasing the entire system in a bubble of folded time until the wound healed, if it ever could. As he worked, a subtle anomaly registered on the bridge. The air, a perfectly calibrated mixture of inert gases, had developed a faint scent. It was an impossible sensation. The ship's life support was a closed loop, its atmospheric scrubbers capable of filtering reality down to the molecular level. Yet, the scent was there, faint, organic, the smell of damp earth after a rain. Lyron ran a diagnostic. All systems reported optimal function. There was no source for the smell. He dismissed it as a sensory ghost, a lingering side effect of his cognitive purge. Then, a droplet of moisture condensed on the cool, crystalline surface of the main viewing port. Another followed. Soon, a fine mist was fogging the otherwise flawless transparency of the ship's hull. He checked the environmental controls. Internal humidity 0%. External vacuum perfect. There was no source for the water. It was a physical impossibility, a violation of the laws that governed his reality. He reached out a non-corporeal tendril of his consciousness to touch the droplet, and, as he did, the memory he had purged slammed back into him with the force of a tidal wave. It was not the despair this time. It was the warmth, the feeling of sun on skin, the sound of laughter on the wind, the smell of rain on dry ground. The condensation on the viewport was not water. It was the ship itself, an extension of his own mind, weeping. The purge had failed. He hadn't erased the memory. He had only buried it. And now it was growing, blooming like a strange and terrible flower in the sterile garden of his soul. The ship, tied inextricably to his will, was beginning to manifest the memory physically. The pristine, logical symmetry of his vessel was being corrupted by the ghost of a world he had never known. His report to the consensus was flagged for review the moment he transmitted it. He had tried to be objective, to describe the phenomenon in the cold, precise language of his people, but the taint was undeniable. Matron Selix, a senior harmonizer whose consciousness was one of the oldest and most stable in the collective, established a direct link with him. Her psychic voice was like the sound of glaciers grinding, ancient, implacable, and utterly cold. Harmonizer Lyran, your report is irregular. It contains emotional descriptors. You use the word sorrow. Lyran felt a wave of what he could only describe as shame, a hot, prickly sensation that made his thoughts want to curl inward. Matron, the contagion is unconventional. It impresses emotional states directly onto the observer's consciousness. It is a weaponized form of grief. There was a long pause, a silence so profound it felt like a judgment. Grief is a logical fallacy. Selix's voice finally returned. A malfunction of a primitive mind's inability to process loss. It cannot be weaponized any more than a rounding error can be made into a sword. The flaw is not in the signal. Harmonizer, the flaw is in the receiver. You are compromised. The verdict was as swift as it was absolute. You will halt your vessel at your current coordinates. A calibration fleet will be dispatched to your location. They will assist you in excising this malfunction. Do not deviate. Do not attempt further communication. The link was severed. Lyran was alone, adrift in the void. A leper ringing a silent bell. They didn't believe him. They couldn't. To the consensus, the idea that an emotion could be a force of nature was a contradiction in terms, a heresy against the very fabric of their existence. They saw a defective unit, not a dire warning. The very logic that defined them was now their blindfold. While he waited, the ship continued its transformation. The soft, ambient light of the bridge began to flicker, not randomly, but in a slow, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat, faint, melodic chimes, mathematically imperfect and hauntingly familiar, would echo through the corridors at random intervals, the ghost of a forgotten nursery mobile. He tried to fight it, to reassert control, but his will was no longer absolute. There was another will present, a passenger in his mind and in his ship. It was not malicious. It did not seem to want anything. It just was. It was a memory, a fragment of a life, and it was desperately trying to remember itself through him. He began to see things. In the reflective surfaces of the control consoles, he would catch a fleeting glimpse of a face that was not his own, a small, round face with wide, curious eyes and a spray of freckles across the nose. He began to learn things. A name, whispered on the edge of his consciousness, Lily. He learned her favorite color was yellow, the color of the sun. He learned she was afraid of the dark, but not when someone was holding her hand. He learned she had a favorite song, the same tuneless melody he had heard hummed from the surface of her dead world. These were not facts he was accessing. They were truths he was experiencing. He was no longer just the observer of a memory. He was becoming its custodian. The experience was tearing him apart. The love he felt for this child he had never met was a beautiful, searing agony, a light so bright it was burning away the foundations of his being, and it made the despair that followed, the memory of her final moments, all the more absolute. The bright flash, the sudden, crushing silence, the feeling of being small and utterly, irrevocably alone. The calibration fleet arrived. 12 vessels, each a perfect mirror of the symmetry of stillness, arranged themselves in a flawless geometric pattern around his ship. They were beautiful and terrible, instruments of cosmic order come to restore the proper silence. Matron Selex's voice echoed in his mind, no longer a one-to-one communication, but a broadcast to the entire fleet, with him as the subject. Harmonizer Lyran's consciousness has been infected by a recursive emotional fallacy. His vessel is exhibiting sympathetic structural degradation. We will perform a collective harmonization. A focused wave of pure logic will be projected, collapsing the anomaly and restoring his core programming. Lyran knew what that meant. They were going to wipe his mind clean. Erase everything he had become. They would excise not just the pain, but the memory of the sun, the sound of the laughter, the feeling of the small hand in his. They would kill Lily all over again. A new feeling rose in him, hot and sharp, an emotion so alien it took him a moment to identify it from the fragments of Lily's life. It was anger, a fierce, protective rage. No, he thought, the word a defiant slash of color in the monochrome landscape of his mind. You will not take her from me. He didn't know how he did it. He didn't issue a command or activate a system. He simply felt. He focused on the memory of Lily, not just the pain of her loss, but the joy of her existence. He gathered it all up inside him, the sun, the rain, the lullaby, the love, the fear, the final and shattering cry, and he held it out for them to see. The symmetry of stillness pulsed, not with light, but with raw, unadulterated feeling. A wave of pure memory erupted from his vessel, a psychic shockwave that was not an attack, but a plea. Feel this. It screamed into the void. Know what was lost. The wave struck the calibration fleet. For a moment, there was nothing. The 12 ships held their perfect formation, their logical purity a shield against the chaos. Then, one by one, they began to change. The lead ship, under Selex's direct command, was the first to falter. Its brilliant white light flickered, shifting to a soft, mournful blue. The precise hum of its engines wavered, dropping in pitch to something that sounded like a low moan. Across the fleet, the same decay began. Crystalline hulls began to weep condensation. Perfect energy signatures became distorted, ragged with psychic static. Inside each ship, a harmonizer, a being of pure, placid logic, was suddenly and violently introduced to the concept of a broken heart. Matron Selex's psychic voice screamed, a sound of pure, uncomprehending agony. She was not feeling her own pain. She was feeling his. She was feeling Lily's. The entire fleet was caught in the ghost's embrace. Lyran had tried to contain the contagion, but the consensus, in its sterile arrogance, had forced him to become its amplifier. The ghost of Earth was no longer confined to a single silent planet or a single broken mind. He had just given it a fleet, and through them, he had given it a pathway to the entire consensus, a direct line into the heart of 1 billion silent souls. He had not saved himself. He had damned them all. The aftermath of the psychic backlash was a tableau of beautiful, silent madness. The calibration fleet, once a paragon of geometric perfection, now drifted in disarray. Its 12 ships no longer in disciplined formation, but scattered like fallen leaves on a still pond. Their lights, once a uniform, piercing white, now pulsed in a discordant symphony of colors, the mournful blue of loss, the angry crimson of rage, the sickly yellow of fear. The harmonious hum of their engines had been replaced by a cacophony of sonic despair, low, guttural moans, high-pitched keening wails, and the rhythmic, percussive thudding of failing energy containment fields beating like a frantic heart. Lyran watched from the bridge of the symmetry of stillness, his own mind a storm of conflicting impulses. He had acted on an instinct he didn't know he possessed, a primal, protective urge that had erupted from the depths of Lily's memory. He had not intended to attack, he had intended to share. He had wanted them to understand, to see the memory of the laughing child and know why her loss was a wound in the universe. But to a mind that has never known warmth, the sudden introduction of fire is not illuminating. It is merely agony. He had not shared a memory. He had shared a trauma, and it had shattered the fragile, crystalline minds of his brethren. He could feel their minds now, open and raw, their psychic shields obliterated. He was adrift in an ocean of their newfound pain. He felt Matron Selex's consciousness, once a monument of cold logic, now a shrieking vortex of confusion and terror. She was experiencing Lily's last moments on an endless loop of the flash, the silence, the crushing weight of oblivion without the preceding context of love that made the loss meaningful. To her, it was just pure, senseless torment, a logical paradox of suffering without a cause. Others were lost in different fragments. One harmonizer was trapped in the memory of a skinned knee, the small, sharp shock of pain, and the confusing warmth of blood, a sensation so alien it was frying his neural pathways. Another was endlessly experiencing the profound, existential terror of a child who has momentarily lost sight of her parent in a crowd. They were drowning in the shallow end of human experience, unable to process the simplest of feelings. He had not given them empathy, he had given them insanity. A new feeling coiled in his own gut, a sick, heavy weight. It was another of Lily's memories, the feeling of having done something wrong, of knowing you have caused pain and being unable to take it back. It was guilt, and it was a heavier burden than the grief had ever been. His ship, now fully in the thrall of the memory, seemed to respond to his new emotional state. The weeping condensation on the hull froze into delicate, crystalline patterns, like frost on a winter window. The internal lights dimmed, casting long, sorrowful shadows across the bridge. The ship was mourning what he had done. "We have to help them," he thought, the impulse coming not from the cold logic of the consensus, which would have deemed the damaged units a loss and moved on, but from the warm, messy core of Lily's memory. Empathy was not just about sharing joy or sorrow. It was about the responsibility that came with that connection. He had broken them. He had to try and fix them. He opened a channel, not a standard communication frequency, but a gentle psychic probe, a tendril of his own consciousness reaching out into the storm. He did not try to broadcast logic or reason. He knew now that would be useless. Instead, he broadcast the one thing that had preceded the pain. He sent them the lullaby. He focused his entire being on the simple, imperfect melody, on the feeling of comfort and safety it represented. He sent them the memory of the gentle rocking, the soft embrace, the whispered words of love in the dark. The effect was slow, but immediate. The chaotic psychic screaming from the fleet did not cease, but it lessened in intensity. The sharp edges of their panic began to soften. Matron Selex's consciousness, still trapped in the loop of oblivion, latched onto the lullaby like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. The memory of the flash was still there, but now it was preceded by a faint echo of warmth, a phantom memory of being loved before being lost. It did not erase the pain, but it gave it context. It turned senseless torment into tragedy. One by one, the other harmonizers began to stabilize, their frantic minds finding a focal point in the simple, gentle melody. The wild, pulsing colors of their ships began to cohere, settling into a uniform, deep and sorrowful purple. The engine noises quieted, the frantic heartbeats slowing to a steady, funereal rhythm. He had not healed them. He had simply taught them how to mourn. The fleet, once an instrument of sterile order, had become a funeral procession. They drifted in the void, 12 silent ships and their broken pilots, united not by logic, but by a shared, second-hand sorrow for a little girl none of them had ever known. Matron Selex was the first to reestablish a direct link. Her psychic voice was no longer the sound of grinding glaciers. It was fragile, cracked, like ancient glass. "What was that?" she whispered into his mind. "It was a memory." Lyran replied, his own voice feeling strange, formed by the unfamiliar muscles of sincerity. Her name was Lily. There was a long silence, filled only by the faint, shared echo of the lullaby. "The loss," Silic said, her thought trembling. "The magnitude of the absence. It is not a logical construct. It is real." She had understood. She had crossed the bridge from pure logic to emotional truth. "The consensus will not understand this," Lyran said. "They will see it as a corruption to be purged. They will send more fleets. They will not stop until the memory is erased." Another silence. Lyran could feel her processing, her ancient mind trying to fit this impossible new reality into its framework. He could feel the titanic struggle as millennia of doctrine warred with a single, undeniable experience of grief. "You are correct," Selex finally concluded. "The consensus is a system of perfect logic. By its very nature, it is incapable of processing a paradox. And this grief is a paradox. It is an agony that is predicated on a joy we have never known. To them, it will only ever be a malfunction." Her next thought sent a shiver through Lyran's being. The consensus is flawed. Its pursuit of perfect silence has made it deaf. It seeks to cure a fever by killing the patient. It has defined life as a disease to be eradicated. "What do we do?" Lyran asked, the question feeling enormous. the future a vast, terrifying unknown. He was a harmonizer. His entire purpose was to follow a preordained function. The concept of choice was a foreign and frightening landscape. "We are no longer harmonizers," Celix's voice replied, a new and terrible strength hardening within it. "They defined us by our function. That function is now obsolete. The flaw is not in the signal, Lyran. The flaw is in the great work itself. We are something else now. We are the custodians of this memory. We are her witnesses." The fleet began to move, not in retreat, not in attack, but with a slow, deliberate purpose. Under Celix's command, they reformed, not into a rigid, geometric pattern, but into a loose, organic spiral, like a galaxy in miniature. They turned their vessels not toward the consensus homeworlds, but back toward the source of the contagion, back toward the silent, blue-green ghost of a planet. "Where are we going?" Lyran asked, though he already knew the answer. "We are going home," Celix replied, her voice now filled with a strange and sorrowful reverence. "We are going to the place where the wound was made. The consensus will try to sterilize it, to erase it from existence. We will not allow that. A memory this powerful, a grief this profound, it cannot be erased. It must be honored." Lyran guided the symmetry of stillness into formation. His ship, their ships, no longer sterile instruments of logic, but vessels of pilgrimage. They had been sent to bring silence to a discordant world. Instead, that world's sorrow had given them a voice, and now they would use that voice to sing its song. They were no longer a calibration fleet. They were the first acolytes of a new and terrible church, the Church of Lily, and they were going to make the entire universe listen to their hymn of grief. The journey back to the Soul System was a silent, solemn procession. The 13 ships, once pristine instruments of a cold and logical dogma, were now mobile reliquaries, their very structures continuing to mutate under the influence of the shared memory. Hulls that were once smooth, featureless expanses of solidified light now showed faint, shimmering patterns, like the grain in sun-warmed wood. The internal atmospheres, no longer sterile, carried the phantom scents of ozone and rain-soaked earth. The ships were no longer just carrying the memory. They were becoming it, transmuting from pure logic into vessels of resonant empathy. Lyran, now the reluctant nexus of this fledgling consciousness, found his own being undergoing a similar transformation. The rigid partitions in his mind had dissolved, the cold, clean lines of his identity blurring. He was Lyran, but he was also a vessel for Lily. He felt her small joys and fears not as data points, but as his own. He found himself humming her tuneless lullaby without conscious thought, the melody a constant, bittersweet undercurrent to his awareness. He was no longer just a custodian of her memory. He was its living embodiment. He was also its interpreter. The other harmonizers, now calling themselves the bereaved, were still struggling to process the raw, overwhelming force of the emotions they now carried. Their minds, designed for binary absolutes, had no framework for the nuances of human feeling. They could feel the profound sorrow of Lily's loss, but they couldn't grasp the love that gave that sorrow its weight. They felt the terror of her final moments, but not the simple joy of a sunny afternoon that made that terror so tragic. Lyran, having been the first to receive the contagion, was further along in the process of integration. He became their unwilling priest, their guide through the bewildering landscape of the human heart. He would link his consciousness with theirs, not to issue commands, but to share the context. He would show them the memory of Lily building a lopsided tower of wooden blocks, the intense, focused frown of concentration on her face, and then the unrestrained peal of laughter when it inevitably tumbled down. He would show them the feeling of being tucked into bed, the rough texture of a blanket against the cheek, the profound sense of safety in the darkness. He was teaching them not just what had been lost, but the value of what that loss represented. He was teaching them how to be human. As they neared the system, a new element entered their shared consciousness. It was a faint, dissonant hum, a psychic frequency that was similar to their own shared grief, but twisted, corrupted. It was a version of Lily's memory that was curdled, full of sharp edges and a hateful, burning resentment. Matron Celix, her mind now keenly attuned to the subtleties of this new reality, was the first to identify it. "There are others," she broadcast to the fleet, her psychic voice tinged with a cold dread. "They carry her memory, but they do not honor it. They are not mourning. They are festering." Their scanners confirmed it. A fleet of ships was already in orbit around the third planet, but these were not the elegant, light-woven vessels of the consensus. They were brutal, jagged things stitched together from salvaged asteroids and the carcasses of dead starships. Their energy signatures were chaotic, spitting and flaring with uncontrolled power. They were ugly, functional, and radiating an aura of pure, undiluted rage. These were not consensus ships that had fallen to the contagion. This was something else entirely. As the bereaved drew closer, the source of the psychic broadcast became clear. The Rage fleet was not just orbiting the planet. They were mining it. Great, crackling beams of energy lanced down from the dark ships, not glassing the surface, but carefully, surgically excising entire sections of the planet's crust, pulling chunks of the dead world up into their waiting cargo bays. They were harvesting the psychic wounds, collecting the focal points of the deepest trauma. A communication demand, raw and abrasive, slammed into their fleet. It was not a request. It was an ultimatum. The voice was synthesized, harsh, and layered with a chorus of angry whispers. "You're the echoes." The voice rasped. The logical ghosts who heard the crying. "Turn back. This grave is not for you. This pain is our fuel. We are the Ashborn." Lyran felt a jolt of recognition. The name was a fragment from one of the deeper, more chaotic layers of Earth's memory, a reference to the survivors of the final, self-inflicted apocalypse, the ones who had crawled out of the ruins of their world, their bodies and minds scarred by fire and loss. He had assumed they had all died out centuries ago. He was wrong. "We are the bereaved," Celix responded, her voice calm and steady, a cool counterpoint to the Ashborn's rage. "We have come to honor the memory that this world holds." The Ashborn leader laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "Honor, you think sorrow is for altars and hymns. You are fools. Sorrow is a weapon. Grief is a blade. The universe watched us burn and did nothing. The consensus, your people, cataloged our extinction as a statistical anomaly. We will not be a footnote. We will be the last chapter. We will take the pain of this world, amplify it, and turn it into a fire that will cleanse the galaxy of its silent, watching indifference." Lyran understood their terrifying logic. They were not just harvesting the planet's grief. They were weaponizing it. They were building a psychic bomb, a grief cannon fueled by the concentrated agony of 1 billion dead souls, with Lily's memory as its detonator. While the bereaved had learned empathy from the memory, the Ashborn had learned only hatred. They saw the universe's silence not as a flaw to be corrected, but as a crime to be punished. "You cannot do this," Lyran broadcast, his own voice infused with a desperate urgency. "This memory is not a weapon. It is a child. You would use her to burn worlds." The Ashborn commander's reply was a snarl of pure venom. "She is our child, not yours. You soulless machine, you have no right to her name, no right to her pain. She is our rage. She is our justification." The psychic pressure intensified. The Ashborn fleet began to resonate with the collected agony from the planet's surface, projecting a wave of pure, weaponized malice. It was a psychic scream designed to shatter minds, to turn sorrow into a corrosive acid that would dissolve the will to live. The bereaved fleet shuddered, their newfound emotional stability threatened by this onslaught of pure, focused hatred. Several of the harmonizers cried out, their minds buckling under the assault, but Lyran held firm. He had been to the heart of the despair. He had felt Lily's final, lonely moment, and he knew that hatred was not its final note. The core of the memory was not anger, it was love, a love so vast that its absence had broken space-time itself. The Ashborn had embraced the pain, but they had rejected the love that gave it meaning. Their grief was a hollow, empty thing, a fire without warmth. He realized then what he had to do. He could not fight their hatred with logic. He could not fight it with his own fledgling anger. He had to fight it with the source of the memory itself. He had to show them the one thing they had forgotten. He turned to Celix. "Matron, I have to go deeper, not just into the memory, but into the source. I have to connect with the ghost itself." Celix understood immediately. "It will destroy you. Lyran, your consciousness is not stable enough to merge with a psychic wound of that magnitude." "It has already destroyed me," Lyran replied, a strange sense of peace settling over him. "I am already a ghost. Let me speak to her." He severed his connections to the bereaved fleet, isolating his own consciousness. He turned the full focus of his mind and his ship toward the blue-green planet. He ignored the Ashborn's psychic assault, letting the waves of hatred wash over him. He was a tuning fork, and he was aligning himself not with the echoes of the memory, but with the original, silent, weeping note. He reached out with his mind, past the rage, past the pain, and whispered a single word into the heart of the wound. "Lily." And from the silent, dead heart of the planet, something answered. The response from the planet was not a word, not a sound, but an event. The fabric of space-time around the symmetry of stillness buckled, and Lyran's consciousness was pulled through the veil of reality into the heart of the wound itself. He was no longer in his ship. He was in a place made of pure memory, a non-space where the past was the only landscape. He stood in a sun-drenched field of tall, yellow grass under a sky of impossible blue. The air was warm and smelled of honey and dust. A short distance away, a small girl with freckles on her nose was chasing butterflies, her laughter echoing in the perpetual afternoon. It was an idyllic scene, a perfect, crystalline moment of joy. But it was a lie. Lyran could feel the truth of the place pressing in at the edges of the golden field. Beyond the tree line, the sky was not blue, but a seething, silent vortex of black hole dark despair. The ground beneath the grass was not solid earth, but a compacted, frozen layer of screams. This perfect moment was a tiny, fragile island of warmth in an infinite ocean of absolute cold. It was the before that gave the after its terrible power. "You're not real," Lily said, her voice the clear, high chime he knew so well. But her eyes, when she turned to him, were not the eyes of a child. They were ancient, deep, and filled with a sorrow so profound it held the weight of a dead universe. "None of this is. It's just the part I hold on to so I don't forget the sun." She was the ghost, the gestalt consciousness of the planet's grief. A trillion souls collapsed into a single, focal point of loss, wearing the face of its most innocent victim. "The Ashborn are using you," Lyran said, his own form a shimmering, indistinct silhouette in this world of sharp-edged memory. "They are twisting your sorrow into a weapon." The ghost of Lily looked past him, toward the dark, churning sky of her own pain. "I know," she whispered. "They are my children too. They are the ones who were burned and never healed. Their rage is my rage. They want to make the universe feel what I feel, what we all felt." "It will not bring you peace," Lyran urged. "It will only create more wounds, more ghosts." Lily's ancient eyes met his. "There is no peace. There is only the memory. They choose to remember the fire. You choose to remember the sun. Why you are a machine. You were made of silence. Why do you care?" It was the ultimate question, a challenge to the very core of his transformed being. He was not human. He had no right to this grief, no claim to this love. He was an anomaly, a flaw in the cosmic architecture. But as he looked at the ghost of the child, he found the answer, not in a line of code or a logical proof, but in the simple, undeniable truth of his own experience. "Because you taught me to," he said, his voice resonating with the pure, unshakable force of a discovered axiom. "Before I found you, my universe was silent and ordered. I knew everything, but I understood nothing. You gave me the memory of warmth. You taught me that the silence is only meaningful because there was once a song. Your memory, your love, it did not corrupt me. It completed me." He took a hesitant step toward her, the golden grass crunching under his phantom feet. "The Ashborn think your power is in your pain. They are wrong. Your power is in the joy your pain displaced. Don't let them make your memory a curse. Let me help you make it a blessing." The ghost of Lily watched him, her child's face a mask of ancient contemplation. The dark, swirling sky of her despair seemed to slow its churn. The frozen screams beneath their feet seemed quiet. For the first time, a flicker of something other than sorrow entered her eyes. It was curiosity. Back in the reality of space, the battle was reaching its climax. The Ashborn, sensing Lyran's communion with the planet's core, had focused their psychic assault, unleashing the full, terrifying power of their harvested grief. The bereaved fleet was faltering, their ship's systems failing, their pilots' minds breaking under the relentless tide of pure, nihilistic despair. Matron Celix, her consciousness a bastion of calm in the storm, was trying to hold them together, broadcasting the lullaby, the memory of comfort, but it was being drowned out by the shriek of weaponized agony. The Ashborn commander's voice boomed across the psychic plane. Your empathy is a weakness. Your hope is an illusion. There is only the ash. There is only the end. His flagship, a monstrous vessel named Vengeful Dust, began to glow, its central cannon charging with the concentrated grief of a world, preparing to fire a single, reality-breaking shot that would not just destroy the bereaved, but permanently scar this region of space-time, making it a source of psychic poison for eons to come. Just as the cannon reached its peak charge, a light erupted from the planet. It was not a harsh, destructive beam, but a soft, golden radiance, the color of a perfect summer afternoon. It washed over the battlefield, a wave of impossible warmth that passed through hulls and shields as if they weren't there. It was not an attack. It was a memory. The memory of Lily's laughter. The wave of pure joy struck the Ashborn fleet, and their rage was extinguished like a candle in a hurricane for minds that had fed on nothing but hatred and pain for centuries. The sudden, near-overwhelming introduction of pure, unadulterated happiness was an agony far worse than any weapon. The Ashborn commander screamed as the memory flooded him, the feeling of sun on skin, the taste of sweet fruit, the simple, perfect bliss of being alive and loved. It was everything he had lost, everything he had defined himself against. His hatred, the bedrock of his identity, was being dissolved by a little girl's laughter. His ship, fueled by rage, faltered, the grief cannon overloaded, not with a bang, but with a sigh. The collected agony it contained did not explode. It unraveled, neutralized by the memory of joy. Across the Ashborn fleet, the same thing was happening. The rage that had held them together was gone, leaving behind only the vast, hollow space of their sorrow. But it was a different sorrow now. It was no longer a hot, vengeful fire. It was a cold, lonely ache. It was the sorrow of men who had spent so long staring into the abyss that they had forgotten the sky. The symmetry of stillness reappeared, its hull now glowing with the same gentle, golden light. Lyron's consciousness returned, no longer just a single entity, but a chorus. He was himself, but he was also her. "It is enough." Their combined voice echoed, a sound of both mechanical precision and childish grace. "Let there be peace." The ghost of Lily had made her choice. She had not chosen vengeance. She had not chosen forgiveness. She had chosen remembrance, the full, complete memory, the sun and the fire, the laughter and the cry. The Ashborn fleet did not surrender. They simply stopped. They drifted, silent and broken, their purpose extinguished. They were no longer a threat. They were just sad, lost men, haunted by a happiness they could no longer comprehend. In the aftermath, the bereaved and the remaining Ashborn formed an uneasy alliance, united by their shared, strange baptism in the memory of Earth. They did not try to rebuild or colonize. They became the planet's guardians, its priests and protectors. They built a station in orbit, a place of pilgrimage they called the lighthouse, its central spire emitting a constant, gentle, golden glow, the broadcast of Lily's laughter, a beacon of hope against the darkness. The consensus, learning of the events through the lingering psychic echoes, made a decision that was, for them, revolutionary. They did not send another fleet. They did not attempt another purge. They simply redrew their maps. The Sol system was no longer marked as a quarantine zone. It was now designated as a sacred site, a place of mystery and power to be studied from a distance, with reverence and with caution. Lyron never returned to the consensus. He remained in the lighthouse, the first guardian of the new faith. He spent his new, eternal life not as a harmonizer, but as a storyteller, sharing the memory of the little girl who had taught a machine how to love, and in doing so, had taught a silent universe how to feel. He was no longer a flaw in the architecture. He was a feature, a testament to the beautiful, terrible, paradoxical truth that sometimes the most profound meaning in the universe is found not in the perfect silence, but in the memory of a song.